in the role of responsive caregiving in the development of the sort of more emotional and socio-emotional side of children's development and attachment and so forth. But actually, when you look at it, it has a very widespread, it goes way beyond that to lots of domains of development. And I'll give you an example of that in a minute, but just to give you a little flavour because of what we mean by responsive caregiving, I've got a quick video to show you. Here's a baby. And what's neat about this, and this was an issue really brought out by Lynn Murray and others a long time ago, is responsive caregiving is all about responding to the infant's cues, but it's always also a two-way process. The baby is a very active participant in a sort of mutually rewarding interaction. So here's a little video where you can just see how this is a very young baby.
Yeah.
Not sure what the language is actually. And this on YouTube.
Yes,
and you can see how there's a really sort of, often people talk about sort of proto-conversational feel to this, that the baby is responding to the mum and the mum responding to the baby, and there's this very kind of harmonious two-way interaction involved. And in fact, he's getting even more vocal as he goes along, as he gets more into the interaction. He's now possibly imitating her language and her facial expressions. And you can just sort of feel, I think, almost how, of course, how much that's sort of scaffolding the child's development. If you want to learn how to interact, to be social, to learn language, this kind of interaction is creating a sort of scaffolding, a framework, kind of supports for the child's emerging developmental skills. Here's another cute side. You've probably seen this video, but it's really cute, so I'll show it anyway. It's an older child.
Oh, not this one. This is yeah, this last one. That's what I was wondering. I don't know what they're gonna do next season if they did some stuff this time. Exactly what I was thinking. Oh yeah. Right. Don't bring that again. You know what I'm saying? Don't do the same stuff. You know what I'm saying? Yeah, I was like that. Yeah. Like go somewhere else with that. Don't be here. You know what I'm saying?
So you can see how, there's just it's just a lovely kind of conversational thing happening here that you can see, is very dependent on the father's ability in this case to be creative and responsive to the child's cues and kind of elaborate on what the interaction is or where the interaction is going. And you can see how it's helping this little baby kind of become a social being, to learn how to speak, how to interact. He's developing his gestures, and all of these interactions already helping that. You can also see how how positive and warm and happy this interaction is, and I think and I think the key issue there is about what happens when you as an adult are experiencing quite profound depressive experiences, and how hard it can be to engage in that kind of responsive interaction. And of course that's one reason why postnatal and subsequent depression, we think, is linked to later poorer outcomes, because we know that sensitive responsive caregiving is linked to a wide range of outcomes: emotional and behavioral problems, later language development, later cognitive and school readiness, quite strongly too. I don't know how familiar you are with correlations and things, but these are really quite strong correlations. Surprisingly to me, when I first realized this, is that the correlation with language development is actually one of the strongest associations that we observe between sensitive caregiving and children's outcomes. So it's not just in the socio-emotional domain. And we know that's true for postnatal depression too, that it has quite wide-ranging negative correlates, both in terms of emotional development and risk for long-term depressive episodes in the next generation, so to speak, but also for cognition and language. And what do we know about the association between postnatal depression and sensitive caregiving? Well, this is really important in my view, because there's clearly an association. I talked about sort of in a sort of qualitative sense why I think sensitivity can be undermined by depressed mood. And the evidence backs that up. So there's a number of meta-analytic studies that have pooled all of the research on postnatal depression and sensitivity, and we clearly see a consistent association with lower sensitivity associated with postnatal depression. And it's actually quite a weak correlation if you just use normative samples, but in clinical populations where there would be a higher level of symptomatology and probably chronicity, then you see really quite a robust association between postnatal depression and sensitivity. And similarly, you see quite a robust association with attachment insecurity, which is, of course, another really important part of that picture. One really interesting issue that I think is important to think about is the timing of the impact of postnatal depression. And that's really important from the point of view, when I say, depression, that's really important, I think, from when we're starting to think about intervention, because there's been a lot of work looking also at antenatal or prenatal depression and indeed anxiety. And in a series of meta-analyses, colleagues of mine and I have looked at this in some detail, and we see quite consistent associations between prenatal depression symptoms and cognitive and language development outcomes and emotional and behavioural problems in children. And there's an interesting discussion there about whether there's some sort of biological impact of depression during pregnancy, or whether what's happening is that depression during pregnancy is impacting something postnatally, which is then impacting on the child's outcomes. And that's pretty key if we want to understand where should we be targeting our interventions. Recently, we did some work in a large longitudinal study of parents recruited during pregnancy to try and repeatedly measuring depression symptoms across pregnancy. So at 3 time points during pregnancy, and then repeatedly postnatally as well, at 12 months, 24 months, 36 months, and up to age 5, and measured outcomes at age 5, to try and get a sense of how important is it that when the depression is experienced, prenatally or postnatally, and how important is it whether or not one experiences multiple versus single episodes of depression. And this is what we found. So it's absolutely clear, and this is consistent with a lot of other evidence, that chronicity, so the amount of exposure basically that the child has to a parent with depression, really matters. So this is just a series of graphs showing you that the more periods during the study that somebody scored over a clinical threshold for depression, the more symptoms of externalizing behavioral problems, internalizing behavioral problems especially, but also poorer social skills and communication skills at age 5. So we have often focused on thinking about depression as in postnatally as being a sort of happening in a single point in time, and that we should focus on trying to prevent that occurring. But actually what a lot of evidence suggests is that, and it's consistent with the adult literature on depression, is that it's a kind of relapsing and remitting kind of process. So you don't tend to have a single episode, it can come and go. And actually what's really key is to think about over time how much cumulative impact there might be on the child's outcome. And when you think about it like that, you really have to think slightly differently about intervention, I think. We also found that timing matters. And this is just showing the effects of prenatal depression, postnatal depression, and then toddlerhood depression, so a little bit further down the line, and their associations with those same outcomes. And what you can see is there are some lingering associations from the prenatal stage, but the really big impact seems to be coming from the most recent, from the later phases of the study in toddlerhood. So this idea, so sometimes we think of postnatal depression being a kind of early sensitive period kind of effect, and that when it happens early, it might be worse, for example, than later. Broadly speaking, I don't think the evidence is really consistent with that. There may be some small prenatal effects, but actually what really seems to matter is what happens later, and how often it's happening over time. So the key questions I think that these throw up for me are, when should we intervene? Do we want to get in there really early during pregnancy, or do we need to come in later? What's the optimum time for intervention? And given how crucial chronicity is, how do we provide a kind of a level of support or monitoring that effectively addresses the issue that even if you support somebody experiencing depression at one point in time, they will continue to be at risk for later episodes of depression. And I think that's really important, and it might need to encourage us to think about different patterns of support that might be provided, including, having some flexible variation in the intensity of the support that's provided. For example, potentially having quite low intensity support initially, but some ongoing contact. Could be through health visiting services and not necessarily always through perinatal mental health treatment teams, for example. Another key question is, do we treat the depressive symptoms, or do we treat the problems with caregiving, or do we treat both? And that seems to be really important and not a resolved issue. And then finally, there's a lot of variability in how impacted parenting seems to be. We saw that those associations that I've showed before, they're not super strong. So that means that there are plenty of parents with depression who are actually providing very high quality, sensitive, responsive caregiving. And then the question is, well, do they actually need support? And if so, of what nature? And we haven't really figured that out. And I think that's really important to think about in terms of assessment and clinical services. And then finally, the last thing is that we don't know a lot about what the key buffers are and what the key risks are that also need addressing. We've got some pretty good evidence that postnatal depression is also really associated with the couple relationship, if they're in a couple, and might be one of the sort of slightly neglected, really important mediators that can impact on children's mental health. A lot of conflict in the family often goes with depression, and we know that has really pernicious effects for children's later outcomes. So, we also might need to think about how we've widened the scope of what our targets for intervention might be. And that's it for me. I'm going to pass you over now to Rachel.
Thanks, Pascal. That was really interesting, and I know that we definitely share a passion around this area. I'm hopeful that my presentation won't duplicate too much, but we'll build on kind of what you've already been speaking about, Pascal, and coming very much more from a place of kind of the practicalities of working in this area, rather than the sort of research side of things. But yeah, I think the two things are so pivotal that they go together to increase kind of the knowledge and understanding and ultimately the experience of babies and parents. I've got two screens open, so bear with me, guys. I'm trying my best to work this out.
Yeah, while Rachel's just hopefully sharing your screen, just by way of introduction. So yeah, Rachel is a specialist infant mental health midwife for Little Minds Matter, which is part of the Bradford District NHS Foundation Trust. And we know Rachel well. She's also a much valued advisor to the network. So is that working, Rachel? Are you able to share your screen?
Yeah, I'm going to just try and share it as just a window and see if that works.
Oh, yeah.
Fabulous. Okay. Let me see. I'm just working out which bit I need to be clicking on to get the bits I want. So, okay. So yeah, one of the things that we often come across when we talk to professionals and parents about infant mental health is kind of what is it? People are often a little bit shocked to even hear the words of infant mental health, and because I think mental health is so associated with difficulties that associating that to an infant can feel quite difficult for people. So what we're talking about when we're talking about infant mental health is their social, emotional and cognitive development between conception to age 2, so that 1001 critical days. And it's thinking about kind of how they are experiencing the world during that time, how that's impacting on these developmental issues, and kind of thinking about how those things interplay with each other, and what impact parents and caregivers and other adults around them have on that. So I think sometimes people don't realise that babies can have really strong experiences of emotion long before they can ever express that verbally, and that they need that sensitivity that Pascal was talking about to be able to soothe and settle and learn to manage their feelings. So yeah, we know that babies' brains develop rapidly during the prenatal period, the antenatal period, and that things that happen during pregnancy can have a real impact. So when we're thinking about maternal mental health, or you know, other adverse factors in the environment, that those can really have an impact on that development of these really important parts of the baby's brain, even in utero. So you know, high cortisol levels in mum can be passed across to babies in utero, and babies are then born kind of predisposition to be in fight or flight, or can be in very high alert, vigilant states, which is, you know, so important for people to be able to recognise that in young infants, and support that, you know, a different development to continue post birth. So. And I just, this is a slide I just always love to think about. So when we're thinking about a baby's brain at birth, you know, and how much we talk about them as sponges, don't we? They just absorb everything that's around them. You know, they're making millions and millions of neural connections every second. And when you look at the difference between a newborn brain and a 2-year-old, you know, how much has happened during that time, and it just kind of really amplifies to me the importance of intervention at this stage where there might be difficulties in that infant's experiences. So I have got a couple of little videos that I wanted to share just to think about that a little bit further. Now, they come with a little bit of a health warning because they can be quite hard hitting if you've not kind of thought about these things before. And now I'm going to have to try and see if I can share the right window now, because unlike Pascal, I've not been because they're YouTube videos, I can't get them embedded into my PowerPoint sadly, but I'm going to try and see if I can switch. Bear with me. Okay. Okay. Has that switched for you guys? Yeah, cool. Okay. So this first one's just thinking about kind of the impact of stress on the developing brain. Do you have the sound just before I let it continue? Is it playing with sound?
Learning to deal with stress is an important part of healthy development. When experiencing stress, the stress response system is activated. The body and brain go on alert. There's an adrenaline rush, increased heart rate, and an increase in stress hormone levels. When the stress is relieved after a short time, or a young child receives support from caring adults, the stress response winds down and the body quickly returns to normal. In severe situations, such as ongoing abuse and neglect, where there is no caring adult to act as a buffer against the stress,
So it said buffer, it starts buffering.
the stress response stays activated. Even when there is no apparent physical harm, the extended absence of response from adults can activate the stress response system. Constant activation of the stress response overloads developing systems with serious lifelong consequences for the child. This is known as toxic stress. Over time, this results in a stress response system set permanently on high alert. In the areas of the brain dedicated to learning and reasoning, the neural connections that comprise brain architecture are weaker and fewer in number. Science shows that the prolonged activation of stress hormones in early childhood can actually reduce neural connections in these important areas of the brain at just the time when they should be growing new ones. Toxic stress can be avoided if we ensure that the environments in which children grow and develop are nurturing, stable, and engaging.
Yeah, I always think it's well, we all know that, you know, under stress we can't function properly. You know, in time, well, like when you're giving a presentation, your brain is not working as slick as it might do if you're not. You know, so we know that, you know, we go into those primitive parts of our brain when we're under stress, and it's almost impossible to take in new information and learn, which is, you know, just absolutely devastating for a young baby who needs to be kind of really using that time in that early infancy to be developing those parts of the brain to help them throughout their life, to increase their life chances. So I was going to play this other little video just to kind of really highlight the impact on parental mental health and how that unresponsiveness can influence a baby. I don't know if I'm sure many of you will have seen this video before, but I think it's a really good one to think about when we're thinking about postnatal depression and parental mental health, you know, kind of longer term.
Babies this young are extremely responsive to the emotions and the reactivity and the social interaction that they get from the world around them. This is something that we started studying 30, 40 years ago, when people didn't think that infants could engage in social interaction. And the still face experiment what the mother did was she sits down and she's playing with her baby who's about a year of age. And she gives a greeting to the baby gives a greeting back to her. This baby starts pointing at different places in the world, and the mother's trying to engage her and play with her. They're working to coordinate their emotions and their intentions, what they want to do in the world. And that's really what the baby is used to. And then we ask the mother to not respond to the baby. The baby very quickly picks up on this. And then she uses all of her abilities to try and get the mother back. She smiles at the mother. She points because she's used to the mother looking where she points. The baby puts both hands up in front of her and says, "What's happening?" She makes that screechy sound at the mother, like, come on, why aren't we doing this? Even in this 2 minutes, when they don't get the normal reaction, they react with negative emotions, they turn away, they feel the stress of it, they actually may lose control of their posture because of the stress that they're experiencing.
I'll just stop that there. I think that demonstrates quite nicely what Pascal was talking about in terms of the impact that parental mental health can have on a young infant. And, you know, seeing that baby's distress, every time I watch it, I feel that baby's distress and just want to give them a hug. But what we know is that there's lots of babies that this is their daily experience when they're living with somebody who's quite shut down with depressive mood. And obviously there are lots of parents who can be really responsive and reactive and have kind of depression, but for some babies they don't have that, and they don't have many other caregivers around them either to be able to buffer it. Let me just go back to the presentation. So I'll whiz through because I'm very aware of time, and I know that we've got lots to chat about as well. So just thinking about the signs of distress that we might see in babies. So this is in our service, some of the things that we really look for. And some of these things, you know, lots of people wouldn't pick up on them as being something that's to do with that parent-infant relationship and maybe some difficulties within that. And some are obviously quite obvious, but things like when we talk to health visitors and other people who are working with families with young babies, GPs, for instance, you know, talking about feeding difficulties and colic and reflux. These are things that we're seeing more and more of. Now, is that a physiological thing that's changing in our infants, or is it that we're seeing more and more disconnect between infants and their caregivers? So we're seeing higher reports of colic and reflux and those sorts of difficulties in infants. So yeah, just thinking about that long-term outcome, and Pasca's already discussed this, so I won't spend too much time on it, but this early infancy period is so critical for the developing brain and the baby's social and emotional skill development, to kind of really set them up for lifelong relationships, and being able to contribute in society in the way that every person would want to. So thinking more about the services around these babies and families. So this is a lovely diagram that really thinks about kind of us as a professional network and how we hold these families, and how we provide the support that they need in those early days, but then also ongoing throughout the life course of the child, because as we know, you know, this isn't just a thing that's about that early infancy, but can carry on throughout childhood. So our service, Little Minds Matter, the way that we work, so we work as a preventative service, so we try to get in as early as possible to promote this early attachment relationship. And we do that through training professionals. So we have a big training package where we train the workforce in our district around identifying and acting on parent-infant difficulties. We do that also through consultation, where we provide space, reflective space for professionals to come and think together about, you know, what is the infant trying to tell us, and how can we support that relationship. We also do it by getting key messages out to the community. So, you know, the people on the ground who are raising these little babies and might need the additional support. We've got a big social media presence now, so we do that. But we have a really diverse community in Bradford. So we try and be as creative as possible around that. And then we obviously provide direct clinical work through therapeutic approaches. And we work with babies that are under 2 where there's signs of distress. And this is our team and the kind of interventions that we deliver. So we're made up of a really multidisciplinary team with some really good skill sets. And we offer a really wide package of support options for families, dependent on the level of need. So that's it from me. Thank you for listening.
Oh, brilliant! Thanks so much. Thanks so much, Rachel, for giving us a bit of an insight into, you know, your team and how you support families.